So yesterday we took a really, really deep dive, and I talked about it being like a crucifixion, and that today is about resurrection. So hopefully these two lectures this morning and this afternoon will be about the resurrection experience. And if you have the outline before you for lecture 5, it says awakening, working in the trenches. And the afternoon lecture will be awakening, working in the heavens. So this morning is kind of hands-on practical kinds of exercises, and the afternoon kind of more esoteric, mystical. So the outline, if you have it before you, I'm going to cover 6 main points this morning. The first one I call surfing our history. The second one I call transformation versus change. Thirdly, surfing temptation. I'm going to look at the dark side of temptation and the light side of temptation. Number 4, completing karma. I spoke about 4 different levels of karma, a few days ago. Today I want to talk about dimension 5 of karma, the mystical dimension of karma. Number 5 I call becoming a karma gobbler, and then number 6, coming awake. So that's where we hope to go to this morning. So one of the questions I'm frequently asked, since I'm a big advocate of reincarnation, because for me it solves so many psychological problems, so many sociological problems, and so many spiritual problems. I've had about 11 reincarnational experiences myself in the course of the last 33 years. And I'm often asked, what is the value of reincarnation, if we can't remember previous lifetimes? And what I like to say to it is that for the first maybe 2 or 3 years of your life this time around, you have no memory of the events that happened to you. But your character and your personality was largely formed during those 2 or 3 years, over which you have no conscious recall. And therefore, the fact that we don't have conscious recall over something doesn't mean that we're not being influenced very significantly by the events that happen then. And I believe the same thing is true of reincarnation, that even if we don't have conscious recall over previous lifetimes, they're hardwired. The experiences of those lifetimes are hardwired into us. And as we incarnate again, all of that information and all of that experience is actually available at an unconscious level, and it drives our performance. And so I believe that we reincarnate just not as individual human beings, but even as a global community. And in response to one of the questions yesterday, I think it may have been actually, from Marlene, his husband, that I talk about different timelines and the fact that I believe that time isn't linear, that time is cyclical, and that the same kinds of patterns tend to repeat in periods of human history, what Hindus will call the yugas or even the Mahayugas. And they talk about cycles that take 4.32 billion years. And then lesser kind of fractals of that, 4.3 million years, and then smaller ones. So when you look through history, you begin to see patterns keep recurring. And the reason is that we're trying to harvest previous cycles in order to deal with the present cycle in which we find ourselves. And so I want to start off then by just giving my own definition of history. And I would say that history is the tracks of humanity on the beaches of time. When we look back, at the cycles of previous cycles, what we're looking at actually are the tracks of humanity on the beaches of time, the reincarnational beaches of time. And we rewrite and we obliterate these tracks at our own peril. If we try to wipe out those tracks on the beaches of time that represent our previous, our previous histories, we run into huge problems. We can't obliterate or try to wipe out those tracks. We're meant to benefit from them and learn from them. And so, as I said yesterday, you can't create a loving, peaceful, vibrant future by destroying reminders of the past, either at an individual level or at a global level. And that's why it's very painful to me when people, new civilizations come in and obliterate the traces of previous civilizations, like the burning of the great library of Alexandria, which happened twice, this extraordinary kind of repository of the wisdom of planet Earth at the time. So we wipe out, memories of the past at our own peril. So we should be looking at those tracks and learning from those tracks, because we're revisiting the same patterns again and again. And I believe this is true at an individual reincarnational level and at a global reincarnational level. So you are who you are because of where you've been. And you can only become who you want to be by honoring your journey and learning from both the mistakes and the successes. And so we build upon our histories. We incarnate these histories as learning opportunities from ourselves, both the mistakes we make, and the successes that we have. And so when I look at what's happening in our world culture right now, where there are so many people who are retreating into a jail cell of our own making, created by self-doubt or self-hatred or shame, I say it is time to wake up and come out of the closet. Stand up and be counted. Speak your truth. Talk from your own history, your own, mistakes even, and your own successes, and be a free person. Set your family free, set your nation free, and set our world free. For many, many years, I've been talking about my perception that we're at a splitting point in human evolution. I've been talking about this for many, many years, that in the very same way that hominids split into Homo neanderthalis and Homo sapiens and Homo denisovan and Homo floresiensis, we're at a bifurcation point in human evolution at this stage. And I've called this a bifurcation point between what I call where Homo sapiens sapiens is going to split into either Homo spiritualis, who are people who operate out of love and compassion, or what I call Homo sociopathicus, people who operate out of greed and violence. And we have volunteered, all of us, to be on planet Earth at this bifurcation point. We volunteered to be here now. And we volunteered to try to create evolution through transformation, not revolution through violence. There's a huge difference between those, between evolution through transformation on the one hand and revolution through violence on the other hand. Homo spiritualis is committed to evolution through transformation, and Homo sociopathicus is committed to revolution through violence. So that's the second point I want to make then. I want to talk about the difference between transformation and change. We tend to use these words as kind of synonyms. Transformations equal change. And for me, they're radically different. Transformation, I would describe as the slow, gentle, compassionate evolution of our species. Change, on the other hand, tends to be rapid and violent and revengeful revolution. And it always backfires. Change always backfires. When you have to employ rapid, violent revolution, initially it appears to be making a significant, important change. It never does. It always backfires. And you look at all the great tyrants, even in our own lifetime. You look at Idi Amin. I lived 30 miles from the Uganda border when Idi Amin was in Uganda. I lived in Kenya. And I saw, he was welcomed literally when he walked down through the streets of Kampala, having overthrown the previous regime. People came out and there were tens of thousands to applaud him. There was this total rapid change of government. And what happened is, by the end of his regime, he had killed 300,000 fellow Ugandans. And so we see the very same thing with mafia vendettas, revenge killings that just spawn more revenge killings. That's what change does. Transformation is very, very different. So I believe that transformation must involve individual commitment and at the same time, overhaul of the systems. And I've used this example many times. When I lived in Kenya, a lot of my work had to do with kind of meeting basic needs like food and water, because I lived in a semi-desert area, and we only got rain 2 months of the year, and we had seasonal rivers, and for the rest of the time it was really very difficult to access water. And so a lot of what I did was to try to get assistance from European agencies to kind of help us build water systems where I lived, and most of these systems were really successful, but I remember 2 systems that failed miserably. And on one occasion, a 2-year project in which we had put down PVC piping to take water into a village from a water source that we had dug down deeply to access. And after 2 years of work, we turned on the faucet in the village center for the water to flow. And nothing happened. There wasn't even a trickle. And we're wondering, we spent 2 years trying to create this system and there's no water at the end of it. And then we go back along the pipes, and some warrior from another village, whose village did not get a water supply, had literally walked the length of the pipe with a spear, just piercing the PVC piping, every 100 meters. And the water was just, gushing out of these pipes. So what I saw was that even with good water, you need a good transportation system. You need good pipes. If the pipes are leaky, it's not going to work. And for me, the pipes represented the systems, and the water represented the people who staff those systems. In the second one that failed, and it was only one out of very, very many that succeeded, in this one, we piped water successfully to a village over a 2-year period, and we turned on the faucet in the village square, and everybody begins drinking from it, and everybody's dead happy. And 4 or 5 days later, we're all down with dysentery, because somehow the water source itself was polluted. Not intentionally, but it was polluted. So that represented for me the people who staff the systems. And therefore, transformation has to happen at 2 levels. There has to be an overhaul of the systems of, incompetent or corrupt systems. But it has to be people by individuals who are committed to their own personal transformation. You can have the best systems in the world, but if the people who staff those systems are corrupt, they'll corrupt the systems. And you can have the best people in the world, but if they're trying to operate in corrupt systems, they're not going to be effective. So Big Grab is very important then as we think about trying to create homo spiritualis, that indeed as we overhaul corrupt systems and replace them with great systems, every single one of us as individuals, we have to be personally committed to our own personal transformation so that we have good water flowing through good pipes. That'll be my second point, the difference between transformation and just mere change. The third point then I want to talk about, I call it surfing temptation. And initially, temptation seems to be an evil. So you wonder, why am I putting it in resurrection? Because in some senses, once you build free will into the equation, then the more advanced the individual is, or the civilization is, or the species is, the greater our abilities and the greater the temptations are. And all temptation ultimately is a kind of an attempt to control the resources, whether those resources are people or institutions. And so very, very often the power mongers are tempted, to take control of the political system, religions, the news media, finances, education, agriculture, medicine, and the military. So again and again and again, the temptation is to exercise control over all of these institutions. And as I said yesterday, that Lord Acton very famously said, power corrupts, and great power corrupts greatly. And so the more power you have, if power is allied to a free will, by an individual or a group of people who are megalomaniacs, then we got really, really problems. And it's been my experience as I've kind of trolled human history, that there's a tendency for what I would call as narcissistic megalomaniacs to rise and to self-promote to leadership positions in all kinds of governing bodies and all kinds of hierarchical systems. It's like they managed to come to the top. They're self-promoted to all kinds of positions of leadership in all of these institutions that I've mentioned. So that is the temptation of power. So that's the dark side of temptation. The light side of it, as I mentioned yesterday, is Rumi saying in the 12th century, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field, I will meet you there. And Shakespeare saying, there is neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. In other words, there is a beyond even ethics, beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a mystical field, and that's the place that we need to meet. So in that place then, evil, or even Satan, if Satan be an actual entity, is actually, we're meant to work with this reality in order to grow spiritually. And this then becomes, temptation is not an invitation to evil, it is an opportunity to hone our discernment faculties. There's a great teaching of St. Francis Xavier, the founder of the Jesuits. He talked about When he was training spiritual directors, he talked about the discretionis spirituum, the discerning among spirits. So temptation is an invitation to develop the faculty of discernment, to figure out what is mere change and what is transformation. And we see all the great avatars are tempted. Right before they begin their public ministry, there's always some kind of a significant temptation. And you see it in the life of the Buddha, where he's tempted by Maya as he's sitting under the Bodhi tree. And you see with Jesus in during Lent, the 40 days before he begins his public ministry. But I've come to the conclusion that temptation is not a test. It is a training. It is not that God is saying, I wonder how you'll do if I throw this curveball at you. That is not what it's about. It is not about a test. It is about a training opportunity. And that the whole purpose of temptation is to train us to use our discernment to gravitate and orientate toward light and to eschew the darkness. Now, in this model then, the word perfection becomes really, really important. When we read it in the scriptures in the New Testament, that Jesus says, you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And the word that's used in Greek is the word telos, from which we get the English word teleology. Now, perfection does not mean a stainless steel sinlessness. That is not what telos means in Greek. Telos means to be committed to the purpose for which we incarnated. Telos is what happens inside a little acorn. An acorn is committed to becoming an oak tree. And no matter what the environmental insults might be, whether it falls on a piece of concrete or it's abandoned at the side of a road, it'll try its damnedest to become an oak tree, because perfection consists in becoming that which it volunteered to become. And that's what perfection means for us. Perfection is to be committed to picking myself up again and again and again, no matter how many times I've fallen or how many times I've gone astray, and reorient myself to the purpose for which I've incarnated in this lifetime. And so in some senses, to use a kind of an archer image, you know, the archer improves her aim by looking where previous arrows have landed. The arrow gives us a feedback. Did I aim too high, too low, too far to the right or to the left? That's what perfection means. It means looking at the feedback from previous efforts. And this is true at an individual level, at a cultural level, at a national level, and at a global level. Where have our arrows landed in the past? Have we hit the bullseye? And if not, how do we need to adjust our aim? And so temptation then is the realization that God could have just created robots who are pre-programmed to be good, and then everything would be fine in planet Earth, except that we'd all be artificial intelligence. We'd all simply be robots. So a very important part of the evolutionary trajectory is the free will allied to developing intellectual and technological skill sets. So when you look then at the four possibilities of our behavior, if I'm unconsciously good, I'm merely lucky. If I'm unconsciously evil, I'm merely asleep. If I'm consciously evil, I'm pathological. And if I'm consciously good, I'm enlightened. So here are the four possibilities. We can live at the unconscious level completely, and whether we do good or bad, it's only a matter of the luck of the draw. When we live consciously, then we're going to act either pathologically or from an enlightened perspective. And obviously, of the four possible panels, this is the one for which each of us volunteered. We volunteered to come fully awake and to be enlightened human beings. So that's what I mean by, temptation, not as a test, but as a training mechanism. Number 4, then, I'm going to talk about completing karma. And I think it was on day 1, I spoke about 5 levels or 5 aspects of karma. And the first one is just, the simple basic notion of karma, which is just cause and effect. A causes B, and it's the single most important law in science. All of science is predicated on the fact that if you see an effect, there must be a previous cause. And if you create a cause, there will be subsequent effects. All of science is built on that single premise, cause and effect. All of mysticism is built on the same thing. When you look at B, there's probably an A that caused B. And if you do C, there'll probably be an effect that we call D. And so the very basic level of karma is just cause and effect. The second level of it I asked is, does it work? And I gave the example of a hungry lion, who hunts a skunk and attempts to kill and eat the skunk. And the skunk just dive bombs him with this noxious odor. And so the question the lion is asking himself is, did it work? I wanted breakfast. Is that what I got? No, I'm not going to chase skunks anymore. And so it's did it work is the second level of karma. Thirdly, if it worked, was it good or bad? Was the effect that came, was it ethical or moral or not? And I give you the example of walking in a little park in Palo Alto near a church that I lived in, St. Aloysius, and coming across, an adult female with 2 children and a little squirrel falling out of a tree, and the adult female grabbing the squirrel and shaking it to death. And then I told you finally that this adult female was an Alsatian dog. And so did that dog do good or bad? So you have to introduce a moral code or an ethical consideration into level 3 of karma. And then level 4 I suggested was going beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing into a field. And that's what I want to pick up on right here now. I want to call it completing karma. So this level in some sense would be dimension 5 of what I mean by karma. And there's a beautiful Jewish phrase for that. It's called Tikkun Olam, which literally means the healing of the world. And it's a foundational concept in mystical Judaism, in Kabbalah. So it means that in some senses, we are responsible for the state of creation. Not so much because we caused it even, although we have caused it in some ways. And I always distinguish the word responsible or responsibility has 3 very different meanings. Responsibility can mean it's my fault, I caused it. Our responsibility can mean it's up to me to fix it. Our responsibility can mean I have the ability to make a response. And they're very, very, very different. So it can sometimes mean it's my fault, I did it, I caused it. In some senses, it can mean I didn't actually cause it, but it's up to me to fix it. In other senses, I simply have the ability to make a response to any situation in which I find myself. And so we then have to figure out, when in completing karma, which level or which levels of this word responsibility are pertinent to our discussion. And sometimes it's all 3. Sometimes we actually have contributed to causing things as individuals, as cultures, and even as a species. And sometimes, even if we haven't caused it, it's up to us to fix it because there's nobody else around to fix it. So even if you haven't engaged, in murderous activity, there's murder in our world. You're saying, I will try to fix the world in which I live. And the third one is we have to be really creative in thinking among all the possible responses I could make to the world situation or the national situation or my particular community situation or my family situation, what is the best possible response I can make to the situation in which I find myself. And so in some senses then, it's the realization that we're all self-aware fractals of source who volunteered to bring creation back into alignment with the divine essence. That's basically the mission of anybody who comes awake. It is the realization that we are self-aware fractals of source who volunteered to bring all of creation back into alignment with the divine essence. That's what we're here to do as individuals and as human beings. And that's what I mean then by completing karma. And this is where we start looking at some of the great avatars in history. And we begin to see that people like the great avatars like Jesus are the shining archetypes of Tikkun Olam. Jesus, as a Jewish rabbi, would have been absolutely aware of this mystical teaching within his own wisdom tradition of Tikkun Olam, of healing the world. And so we read in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians that Jesus Christ, who did not know sin, became sin. In other words, this extraordinary individual who lived an entire lifetime in complete alignment with God and source and love and compassion, he became sin in the sense that he dedicated his life to healing the sin he saw all around him. Now, so we have these great archetypes then, many great archetypes, like a Buddha figure, maybe in our own time a Mother Teresa figure, or a Nelson Mandela figure, who have dedicated themselves to healing the darkness of the world in which they found themselves. And we begin to realize that, I said to you one time that I had this great vision many years ago, where I saw great souls standing in front of God and volunteering for various kinds of missions. And this great soul, who can be called Gaia or Pachamama, put her hand up and said to God, I will volunteer to animate that third rock from the sun in that solar system, and I will breathe life on it until I manage to throw up a life form which becomes aware of its own divinity, and ipso facto, the divinity of all other life forms with which it shares the planet. And she spent 3.7 billion years creating such, a being that we call Homo sapiens sapiens, on the verge of becoming Homo spiritualis. That was her mission. So there's this great passage in Paul's letter to the Romans where he says, we know that creation itself is groaning in labor pains for the liberation of the children of God. It's almost as if all of nature has been waiting with bated breath for this breakthrough on the part of some hominid species to break through into the realization of divinity, so that all of nature can come alive with the realization of its own inner divinity. And Paul puts that very beautifully, that creation is waiting with bated breath. Is this it? Is Homo sapiens sapiens going to be the people that break through and come to the realization that everything is a fractal of source, so that we too, whether we're trees or mountains or rivers, can break through into the realization of our own inner divinity? That's what we're here to do. When we build upon that realization, we realize that in order to be healers in a violent world, we cannot resort to violence ourselves, either in our thoughts, in our words, or in our actions. And that for me is the huge difference between change and transformation. There are people out there, very many people, good people even, who see the state of the world and they're attempting to violently overthrow the regimes, the corrupt regimes, and the darkness of our times. And all they're doing is that they're throwing gasoline on an inferno. If we are serious about being followers of the Christ archetype, whatever religious tradition we're pursuing, we cannot use violence in our thoughts, in our words, or in our actions to overthrow the darkness and the violence of our times. So Christ very famously said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I. I'd like to paraphrase that and say the following. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in love, there is Christ consciousness. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in anger, there is chaos consciousness. We have to be really careful of the groups we're forming and the ambience and the culture of the dialogue we're pursuing. Because if we're gathered in anger, we're creating even more chaos. Unless we're gathered in love and compassion, we're just adding fuel to the fire. So that's what I mean by completing our karma. Point number 5, I call it becoming a karma gobbler. So what I'm talking about here is I'm going to talk about several kinds of practices that I'm advocating, that if we really want to be karma gobblers in the sense of Tikkun Olam, in the sense of healing the world, there are particular kinds of practices we need to engage in. And the first one I would say it is, we have to become members of an intentional community. And for some of us, that'll mean actually, meeting and rubbing shoulders with companions of various kinds. And for others of us, it'll be Zoom encounters, or email exchanges. But every single one of us needs a community. And in the old times, community was predicated upon geographical proximity. We created community by talking with the people who lived in our geographical neighborhood. We're not confined to that anymore. There are lots and lots of ways of creating community in our times, but we have to create intentional communities. And there should be small little groups. Yeah, if you go over 150 or 200 members, people don't know each other anymore. It's very different. Being part of a community of like 1.2 million Catholics, it doesn't work. The vast bulk of these people you're never going to meet. You're never even to dialogue with or hear from. And so it's going to be small communities, every one of whom is known to everybody else. And that was why in our community in Palo Alto, on Sundays during the sign of the peace, we took time out so that everybody in the church met everybody in the church every Sunday during Mass. There was nobody in our church who didn't know everybody in our church, and there was nobody in our church who wasn't known by everybody in our church. So it is important to create the kinds of communities, whether it's online or in person, which are small enough, where everybody can be known and cherished by everybody else. Now, an intentional community should do two things for us. It should support us in our search for truth, and it should challenge us in our beliefs. If it doesn't support us, then there's no point in being part of a community. We might as well just go it alone. But if it doesn't challenge us in our belief systems, we simply just become a cult, following some kind of a perceived leader, whoever that might be. So it becomes really important that we share different perspectives. So intentional community would be the first practice, where we support each other's journeys and challenge each other's perspectives. The second practice I advocate is what I call creating a personal cosmology. Now, every one of us is actually operating according to an internalized cosmology, but for the vast bulk of us, it's a cosmology that has been unconsciously acquired from our parents, from our teachers, from our churches, from the newspapers. And when we're in any particular life situation, it is unconsciously accessed. And so if I say to you, why did you say that? Someone said, well, seemed like, the right thing to say. Or why did you do that? Well, seemed like the appropriate thing to do. But most of us have no idea why I said that or why I did that, because I'm operating according to a previously programmed protocol, which is dictating what I'm going to say and what I'm going to do, because it's never been examined, because it was unconsciously acquired and now it's being unconsciously accessed. So our cosmology has to be brought to full consciousness. It has to be constantly tweaked by interfacing with other people's cosmologies, so we can create a meta model which is capable of doing the following things. An adequate cosmology should be able to incorporate all of your own personal experiences. If you're operating according to a cosmology which can't explain some of your experiences, it's an inadequate cosmology. You have to keep tweaking it until it can explain and accommodate all of the experiences you have, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Secondly, your cosmology must help you make sense of the world in which you find yourself. If it can't explain what's happening in the world, it's an inadequate cosmology, whether it's the darkness of our times or the light that you're attempting to light. Your cosmology has to be able to make sense of the world in which you find yourself. And thirdly, your cosmology should be able to give you practical tools to help you transform the world. If all your cosmology affords you is a way to analyze the world, but you have no ability to influence the world, then it is still an inadequate cosmology. So that's the second practice I advocate, creating a personal cosmology. A third practice then would be creating some kind of a regular daily spiritual practice. You have to build some kind of schedule, some kind of almost ritual into your life that allows you on a daily basis to center yourself and come back to your base. And your base is that you are a holographic fractal of God. Now, what are we talking about here? It could be meditation. It could be spending time with nature. It could be playing with little children and watching not just their innocence, but their extraordinary mystical connection to source. So there's many, many, many spiritual practices, but you have to build some kind of regular daily spiritual practices into your life. That would be number 3. Number 4, at a really pragmatic level, you have to measure your daily performance against the following. You have to be prepared on a daily basis consciously to replace fear with love. To look at, how you're doing. Am I operating out of fear today? And if so, can I replace my fear with love? I have to learn how to replace anxiety with trust. Trust that the God who sent me did not send me down without the resources I need to accomplish the task for which I volunteered. I have to learn on a daily basis how to replace anger with compassion for all of the players, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I have to be able to turn my enemies into friends, at least in my own spirit and in my own mind. I have to replace on a regular basis judgment with wisdom, knowledge with wisdom. Knowledge is merely data which are generated by the senses and processed by the brain, whereas wisdom are data which are generated by the soul and processed by the heart. There's a very big difference between them. So instead of judgment and mere knowledge, there is wisdom generated by the soul and processed by the heart on a daily basis. And on a daily basis, it is replacing revenge with forgiveness. Instead of wanting to get back at people, either on an interpersonal level or an intercommunity level or an international level, it is replacing all thoughts of revenge, with thoughts of forgiveness. There's a great French proverb that says, to understand everything is to forgive everything. If I really understood all of the variables in the equation of life, I'd forgive everybody for what they're doing. I would have pity for the fact that they're operating out of fear and darkness, but I could understand why they're doing what they're doing. And then in my own mind, I've become a healer rather than a judge. So that would be kind of practice number 4. Practice number 5, I think, is on a regular basis, telling yourself better stories. And I'm not being facetious here. It's very important to tell yourself better stories. There are 3 levels of how you tell stories. There's the narrating self, there's the experiencing self, and then there's the soul self. The narrating self is, the stories you tell to a stranger on an airplane. You're sitting beside somebody on an airplane and they say, hi, my name is Stephen. What's your name? Oh, my name is Sean. Hi, Sean. Tell me about yourself. And I pick out from the billions and billions and billions of experiences I've had in my 74 years, I'm going to pick out maybe 100 and say, here's who I am. And I'm going to tell a whole bunch of stories, that seem to indicate this is who I am. That is the narrating self. That's the story told by the narrating self. The story told by the experiencing self is far, far, far bigger. The experiencing self is aware of all of the experiences I've had in all of my 74 years. But I'm not able to tell everybody all those stories. I don't even want to tell everybody all those stories. So there's the story told by the experiencing self. And then there's the story told by the soul self. The part of me which is eternal, which was never born and will never die. The part of me which has garnered experiences over maybe hundreds of lifetimes in all different configurations. Male, female, gay, straight, black, white, yellow, genius, retarded, whatever, all these different configurations. The soul self has access to all those. So if the soul were to tell a story, that's the story it would be telling. And that's the story that the mystics tell us. They're not that interested in just the mere experiencing ego, and certainly not in just the narrating self, but stories that come from the soul. And these are stories that we tell about our personal journeys. The same thing is true about the tribal stories that we tell as a tribe. Every tribe, again, picks out, particular stories from its history, and that becomes its kind of a self-image. And again, there's an experiencing tribal, part that doesn't get told. And there's an experiencing soul part that never even gets accessed. The third level of storytelling are the cosmological stories, the stories we tell about our universe, the origin of the universe, and the laws of the universe. And again, that comes from 3 different levels. And if we're operating only from a scientific mindset, a materialistic science mindset, we're simply looking at the physical cosmos and trying to explain it from what we see around us. There's a metaphysical cosmos spelled with a K in Greek, which is the realization that there's a cosmology at a metaphysical level of which this physical universe is merely a hard copy or a printout, and operating, telling cosmological stories from that level. And finally, theological stories, which are not based on dogmatic decrees by self-important religious figures, but are coming from the mystical core, the mystical impulse, which is the beginning of all great religions and which gets lost ultimately among the theologians and the hierarchies. So tell yourself better stories, whether they're individual stories, whether they're tribal stories, cosmological stories, or theological stories. That would be a 5th practice. Number 6, try to make as many people as possible smile today. was the clerk in the grocery store, or a passing motorist who defers to you. I live in a little road where, the last 5 miles is so narrow that sometimes we have to pull off the road to let somebody pass through. And just, acknowledging, somebody went over to the side and passed by. I always roll down my window and kind of give a high five. So make everybody you meet today, make them, if you can't make them laugh, at least make them smile. Number 7, be as curious as a child. Children are fascinated by the world into which they have newly parachuted. They're fascinated, by stones that they turn over and discover maggots underneath. They're fascinated by their own poop, and they'll draw art on the walls of the bedroom until you got to go and clean it up. Kids are fascinated by life. They're never jaded. Isn't it time that we became jaded about being jaded? Got fed up with being unhappy and began to be curious instead. And finally, this one, really spend time in nature, however you have access to nature. I happen to be really, really lucky that I live in the middle of a forest on a mountaintop. My nearest neighbor lives a half a mile away, my soulmate, Arlen Brownstein. Apart from that, the next nearest neighbor 2 miles away. So I can feast my eyes and my lungs on fresh air, on mountains and creeks and oak trees and madrona, manzanita, redwood, pine trees, and then the birds and the insects that live here. So whatever you need to do to get out into nature, to expose yourself to nature, it's the oldest teacher on the planet. Literally, it is the oldest teacher on the planet. It's been on the planet, as rocks for 4.6 billion years, as plants for 3.7 billion years, and as, hominids for about 6 million years. So spend time in nature. So that would be my 5th point there. And the 6th point I call coming awake. It's really important for us to realize that we're surrounded by disincarnate avatars, light beings. I've shared with you many, many times about a very powerful vision I had many, many years ago where I was shown an image of planet Earth, the entire Pachamama, the grid system. And there was a lattice of light workers that everywhere there was a line of longitude intersecting a line of latitude. There was a being of light stationed, and one on the North Pole and one on the South Pole. So there was this lattice of light workers around the planet. And when the vision ended, I calculated what that number was, and it was 64,442. If you calculate where lines of latitude and longitude intersect and put the North Pole and the South Pole in. And of course, I realized that this was just a symbolic number. So it's not the actual number which is important, it's the symbolism. There's a great teaching in esoteric Judaism called the tzaddikim, the belief system that there are, at any stage of world history, there are 12 tzaddiks on the planet at the time, enlightened beings. And they may not even know of each other's existence. And they may not even realize that, I am a tzaddik. They may not even realize that. But they're holding the very planet together by their presence on the planet. It's like they're impregnating the planet with their very incarnation, because they're bringing their souls into incarnation, and they know and they remember who they are. So in Judaism, that number is the 12 tzaddikim. In my vision, it was 64,442. It may be a numberless group of light beings who are committed to raising the elevation of our planet right now. So it becomes really important to realize we are not alone. We never were alone, and we never will be alone on this mission. We need to start relearning from each other. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 7,000 cultures and 7,000 languages on our planet. Today, there are only 5,000 languages and 5,000 cultures. 2,000 languages and cultures have been lost, with the perspectives and the wisdom that each language and each culture brings to bear. So instead of creating this kind of blenderization of cultures by what I call cultural colonialism, we need to re-encourage again people to rediscover their culture, their language, their stories, their art form, their music, their social norms, their healing techniques, their cosmologies, and their spiritualities, so we can cross-fertilize and learn from each other. So it's very important for us as we move forward into the realization that we are a global community, that we don't attempt to be a blenderized community speaking one language and one culture, robots goose-stepping to some kind of perceived master. Let's not confuse in our times being woke with being awake. Let's not confuse belligerence with Buddhahood. Let's not confuse slogans and name calling with debate and discussion. Let's not confuse victimhood with self-empowerment, and let's not confuse entitlement with enlightenment. Remember your vow. Here I am, Lord, send me. So I'm going to ask Karen at this stage to cue up this beautiful hymn. And I think it was Joe Gilroy who mentioned at the first day that this is one of his 2 favorite hymns, and it's certainly one of my favorite hymns.
I, the Lord of sea and sky, I have heard my people cry, all who dwell in dark and sin, my hand will save. I who made the stars of night, I will make their darkness bright. Who will bear my light to them? Whom shall I send? Here I am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? I have heard you calling in the night. I will go, Lord, if you lead me. I will hold your people in my heart. I, the Lord of wind and flame, I will tend the poor and lame. I will set a feast for them, my hand will save. Finest bread I will provide, till their hearts be satisfied. I will give my life to them. Whom shall I send? Here I am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? I have heard you calling in the night. I will go, Lord, if you lead me. I will hold your people in my heart. I will hold your people in my
Before we begin the question and answers, I want to make an appeal to you guys. Please, please, please remember that you sang that hymn in God's presence before you came. I love that, and I'm in total agreement with you. And that's why, it's encoded, it's kind of built, hardwired into the system so that we don't have to have conscious recall over it in order to benefit from it. You're absolutely right. Totally agree with you. Because I have to imagine that all of us in past lifetimes, have been guilty of the most heinous of crimes. And if we had to carry all that guilt with us, as well as, mistakes we've made in this incarnation, we would be just totally flattened by it. So awesome observation. Thanks a million for saying that. That's beautiful. That reminds me of only very recently has brain science realized that we have what are called mirror neurons in our physical brains. So it came the result of some very, very terrible experimentation on monkeys, where they would have two monkeys rigged up to electroencephalograms, and then they would create pain for one of the monkeys and watch the reaction of the other one. And the very same areas of the brain in the observer monkey lit up as the pain receptors in the one who was being subjected to torture. And so they call it now mirror neurons, that literally the same area of the observer's brain is activated by observing what's happening in the other person. So you're right. If you're smiling, you're giving both a message to your own brain that things are okay, and you're activating the mirror neurons in the other person at whom you're smiling. And it is literally activating the mirror neurons in that person's brain as well. It's a great observation and a great question, and it's both and. It's not a question of us getting out of the way and let something kind of flow through us, because we have willpower, a hugely important part of our momentum of being human is that we have willpower. We make decisions for or against. There's a natural kind of a flow of God's grace willing us towards a particular end. So I believe that the entirety of creation is a single journey from God's womb to God's heart, that God birthed us, before creation began. And God then wants us to suckle on her breast. So the entire journey of incarnation and the entire journey of the cosmos itself is a journey from God's womb to God's heart. But built into that equation is free will, that we have the ability to go where we want. And God is not going to say, no, you can't go there. If you're given free will, you have to have the ability to exercise it. Now, when we incarnate, we have to have some kinds of spacesuits. And depending on the spacesuit we inhabit, we we take aboard pre-existing conditions of the spacesuit. If you're a world-class rally driver and I give you a Lamborghini, you're going to go around the track at maybe 260 miles an hour. If I give you a battered Volkswagen, from the 1950s with, a flat wheel, you're certainly not going to be able to go around the track at 260 miles an hour. So the vehicle you're driving, the vehicle itself, the spacesuit itself, is also a contributing factor to the speed at which we continue to evolve. So yes, there's this extraordinary driver who's a world-class rally driver in it, who'll maximize the ability of the car to perform. And there are also the limitations of the car in which he finds himself at any one time, which limits his ability to perform to the levels of which he had a better vehicle. So it is both and. We are spirits in spacesuits. The spirits are bite-sized pieces of God, and the spacesuits are, have an ancestry on planet Earth, part of which was violence, and part of which was a predator-prey. So we have to be able to work with both of those elements and transform them both. There's a big difference between judgment and evaluation. Judging is consigning a person or an event to an ontological category, saying somebody is a bad person or saying something was an evil event in some senses. Evaluation is the determination of the appropriate response to a person or a situation. It doesn't involve putting them into any kind of a category whatsoever. It just means I'm faced with the situation, either at an interpersonal level or intercommunity level, and I'm going to have to respond to the situation. In order to navigate my response, I need to have some kind of orienting principles that guide my response. So that's evaluation. But I don't have to pigeonhole the person, and I don't even have to pigeonhole the event in order to determine the appropriate response as a light being, maneuvering my way through this situation. So very, very important to make that distinction. When Christ says, do not judge and you will not be judged. At the same time, Christ is constantly evaluating the situation in which he finds himself and determining the appropriate response to the situation. And sometimes it's healing and sometimes it's confrontation. I've said many times that there are 4 forms of love. I call them the 4 C's. The first form of love is confirmation. It is, "Attaboy, you're doing a great job, stay with it." That's the first form of love. The second form of love is, cooperation. I'm a member of a team. The team needs particular functions to be fulfilled. I'll do this and you do that. That's the second form of love. The third form is compensation. That somebody makes a mistake, drops the ball literally, and I pick up the ball and I make up for the mistake that they've done. That's a third form of love. And the fourth form of love is confrontation. Sometimes it is appropriate to confront and to challenge an individual person or a particular program. And that's a form of love as well. But it has to come out of love. It can't be done out of anger or judgment. It has to come from the fact that here is a brother or a sister of mine engaged in a course of action with which I disagree, which is going to lead, I believe, to bad consequences. And I'm going to call them on their stuff. But I'm not angry with them. I'm not beating them over the head. I'm not trying to punish them. I'm trying to be a healing agent, showing them a different perspective or maybe the consequences of what they're doing right now. So that was an answer to your first part of the question. The second part about future incarnations. It is between the individual soul and its mentors in the in-between lifetimes, what Buddhism will call the bardo state. So when a particular incarnation has ended, I do a life review with the mentors or the angelic beings who prepared me for the incarnation just ended. And I examine how well did I, do my mission? How well did I perform? What mistakes did I make? What do I still need to learn? And we create a future lifetime in which I get the opportunities to learn what I need to learn. And it is not my job to figure out what the future incarnations of anybody else might look like. It is my job to figure out what would my future incarnations look like and learn how can I grow and how can I be a healing agent. And I'm going to let the mentors and the angelic beings who are in charge of the other players determine the programs that they're going to be offered in their future incarnations. Great questions. Let me respond to it. Firstly, thank you so much for sharing those 3 great memories of past incarnations. So in response to that, what I would say is that neurologists think that there are 2 kinds of memory, short-term memory and long-term memory. I think there are 2 kinds of memory, but I think there are genetic memory and soul memory. So genetic memory has to do with the lineage of the spacesuit that I'm inhabiting in this particular incarnation. And so there are things that are kind of natural to this particular spacesuit because of the genetics built into it, the DNA in it. But much more importantly, there are soul memories, particular missions that the soul has been on in over a whole lot of different incarnations. And very definitely that attraction that you felt to Brazil and to France and to teaching and to becoming a religious teacher for a period of time, all those seem to me that they are memories generated by your soul self. I differentiate between the soul self and the role self. The soul self is, as a fractal of source, your identity. And the role self is who you are in this particular incarnation. And so memory comes from those 2 sources, I believe, and that they orient you toward what you're going to do in any particular lifetime, building upon previous lifetimes. And to answer your second question, the best way I know of accessing past lifetimes is to work with a hypnotherapist. If you come across a hypnotherapist, and there are hypnotherapists that specialize in regressive hypnotherapy, and there's a subgroup of those that specialize in life between lives, people belonging to the Newton Institute. So Michael Newton was a very famous American psychologist who went into a past life regression and then specialized in the bardo state, what happens between incarnations. And he's written 2 very famous books. One of them is called The Journey of Souls, and the other one is called The Destiny of Souls. And his name is Michael Newton, Newton. So that's a great place. And they have a list of resources if you want to make contact with a practitioner who does regressive hypnotherapy in your own area, you can access that easily. Thanks a million. You're absolutely right. So that little boy you're talking about was called James Lineker, and he was shot down in Iwo Jima near Japan. And he actually met with his sister from that lifetime, who was an 84-year-old woman, at some stage where we united. There's a department in the University of Virginia called the Department of Perceptual Studies, where they study reincarnation and have written a lot of great stuff. And there's one book particularly called Children Who Remember Past Lives by a mother, who had this experience with her own son at some stage. So if you want some really, really good scientifically researched material on reincarnation, the Department of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia is a great place to go. In answer to your second observation, that I totally agree with you, that the understanding of reincarnation is the single most important sociological factor in shedding our kind of prejudices this time round. That if I have been in all the other positions right now, how can I possibly get angry with or be judgmental of people who are in different configurations right now? So an understanding of reincarnation frees us up from identification and the prejudices attendant upon the particular spacesuit that I'm wearing right now.